always from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to accompany memories. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. Eudora Welty, in one writer's beginnings, published by Harvard University Press, wrote, and I quote, "The memory is a living thing. It too is in transit. But during its moment, all that is remembered joins and lives. The old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead." Unquote. Eudora Welty in one writer's beginnings. This hour we'll remember with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Lady Antebellum and Need You Now. Vanessa Carlson with a journey of 1,000 miles and Boyz II Men in the still of the night. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. This hour, we're remembering. Anita Diamant in the Boston Globe magazine some years back wrote, and I quote, "It is patently wonderful to have a river in your city. Any body of water is like a sigh of relief in the non-stop urban conversation. Every vista turns sunlight into liquid stars, gives respite and healing to eyes weary from pavement and page. Even at a distance, the river makes its peace. The water view makes morning commuters perk up and forget themselves. Maybe it makes them remember the last time they stared out to sea. The city looks lovely, but the river puts things in perspective." Unquote. This hour, remembering Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. The Honeydrippers, On the Sea of Love, and Van Morrison, Into the Mystic. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Today I sat watching the birds at our feeders, and I remembered this very old study. This was reported by Southern News and featured in the August 1984 issue of the Reader's Digest, and I quote, "Researchers have discovered that bird brains aren't as scattered as were once thought. A University of Toronto scientist says some birds' memories appear to far surpass those of any other animal species. Their memories are so remarkable that Professor Sarah Shuttleworth says she and her colleagues forced to use pens and paper to keep track of all the information that chickadees, nutcrackers, jays, and other food-foraging birds can keep cataloged in their heads. Could you, for example, remember where you hid 33,000 seeds? If not, your memory is inferior to the average Clark nutcracker, which buries pine seeds in caches of 4 or 5 seeds in the late summer and returns months later to dig them up. Until now, scientists have been reluctant to credit birds with such intelligence. They believed birds hunted at random for their food stashes." Unquote. It gives me reason to believe that some of our memories are also buried in different places. Our catalyst to finding them may not be as strong as the nutcracker's need for food, hence they remain buried. But when the right stimulus comes along, we find them exactly where we hid them away. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Whitney Houston and I Will Always Love You, The Beatles, In My Life, and Sarah McLachlan, and I Will Always Remember You. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I also remembered this writing from back in the 1980s. Christopher Andre from the Christian Science Monitor wrote, and I quote, "For whatever reason, I find that my attitude to memory is changing. I have been too rigorously down on it. Memories have seemed soft and unprogressive. But I suspect now that by throwing them out as so much bathwater, I have at the same time thrown out a baby or two. To see freshly is not necessarily to totally abolish yesterday. Nobody rightly chooses to live in the past. But how cruelly should we abandon it?" Unquote. Christopher Andre from the Christian Science Monitor. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Renee Olstead with Peter Cincotti, Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, and Simply Red, Holding Back the Years. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I'll tell you what inspired this train of thought this hour. Sometime back, I received a letter from Peg, a listener, that included a copy of an anonymous poem that she thinks dates back to the 40s. I'd like to share it with you again this hour. When in the night you lift your face to see the stars that hold the moon in place, remember, when you sit by fireside to watch the pictures when the flames have died, remember. And when you hear soft melodies or feel the friendly strength of hills and trees, remember. Remember how the stars were bright and the soft glow of firelight, the loveliness of day and night for you and me. And when rough hands are holding us apart, in loneliness we'll dream of days gone by and smile, dear heart, as we remember. Remembering Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Mandy Moore and Cry. And Rod Stewart with These Foolish Things. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Thomas Hood wrote, I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeking in at morn. I remember the fir trees, dark and high. I used to think their slender tops were close against the sky. was a childish ignorance. But now 'tis little joy to know I'm farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.